Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Anthony Akerman's play Somewhere on the Border, which is in this lovely collection South Africa Plays from Nick Hearn Books. It says at the top, new drama from Southern Africa, but this was actually published in 1993, so at this point it's older drama from South Africa. But it's an interesting and important collection because obviously in 1994, the African National Congress wins the elections in South Africa and apartheid is dissolved. So what we get here are plays from the 80s and the early 90s, just on the cusp of that transition from apartheid to post-apartheid. So, Somewhere on the Border is about life in the South African army, which Akerman was in. During at least portions of apartheid, whites were required to do compulsory military service, and so Akerman actually did that. And after he had done his service, South African troops increasingly began making incursions into Angola, which is a different country than South Africa, but the South African government for a long time didn't officially acknowledge that the South African military was invading another country. And the reason that and this is a lot of what Somewhere on the Border is about. And basically the reason that they were invading Angola is that Angola, along with some other countries that bordered South Africa, was very sympathetic to anti-apartheid rebels from South Africa. And so Angola allowed ANC forces and other groups who were labeled terrorists by the apartheid regime in South Africa to operate out of Angola. The other element of this is that Angola had a communist government for a long time, and it was a government supported by the Soviet Union and supported by Cuba. And the National Party government in South Africa was virulently anti-communist. And so this sort of added fuel to the fire of their concern about terrorists operating out of Angola, because it was both anti-apartheid and at least affiliated with communism, if not actually aligned with communist interests. And so this is actually what happens in the second half of Somewhere on the Border, is this group of soldiers, this group of white South African soldiers, go into Angola and essentially commit war crimes there. So we'll talk about the play. But I want to first talk about the production history of the play, very briefly, based on what's in the critical introduction to this episode, because one of the things that it's worth knowing about apartheid-era South African drama is that a lot of playwrights, a lot of directors, a lot of theater artists of all kinds actually lived in exile, actually were driven out of South Africa, especially if they wanted to do plays with interracial casts or multiracial casts, if they wanted to do anti-apartheid drama, if they wanted to do any sort of leftist drama. They were often unable to find work, unable to get permissions to put on plays, etc., in South Africa. And so a lot of them lived in exile in Europe or the US or elsewhere in Africa. Akerman, in 1975, actually went to Amsterdam, and he stayed there, I think, until the early 90s. And so he was in exile for much of his theatrical career, including when Somewhere on the Border premiered in 1982. It premiered in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and so this play, which is a direct sort of confrontation of the ethos of South African militarism and the South African culture of violence under apartheid, premiered originally in the Netherlands. It wasn't until 1986 when it was put on at the Grahamstown Festival, which is one of the major theater festivals in South Africa. It's still going, I believe. And it was staged without Akerman being present, because again, he was living in exile. And one of the interesting things that the critical introduction says here, they had a lot of difficulty getting permission for the actors to wear South African security forces uniforms. And so it says here, even though they were in fictional costumes, members of the cast were beaten up by right-wing terrorists after one of the performances. So this was definitely a play that caused controversy. So let's talk about the play itself and why it might have been so controversial for white South Africans. So there's two acts to the play. In the first act, the characters are in a training camp somewhere in South Africa. They are, for the most part, a pretty normal group of soldiers, with the exception of Doug Campbell, who's a kind of pacifist, hippie, beatnik type guy who doesn't want to conform to the discipline of being in the military. He doesn't believe in the war, etc., etc. We have I think a very, having not ever been in a military myself, but having heard from other people some of the things that occur in military communities or traditional military groups, I think we have a fairly accurate depiction of military life here. There's rampant anti-black racism, especially in South Africa. There's rampant anti-black racism, continual anti-Semitism directed at David Levitt, who's the one Jewish member of this group, continual homophobia, crude sexual humor throughout, and so on and so on. So, and there's this process of disciplining, especially Campbell, who gets disciplined because he challenges authority, and then the bombardier, who's their sort of drill sergeant, Arlie Ermy type figure, comes down on the entire unit because Campbell resists the discipline and the racism that he's trying to instill in them. So some of the things we have that are just very overtly racist are worth noting. And again, it's worth noting that this is 1982. This play is written. It's in the context of apartheid South Africa. So toward the end of the first scene, two characters, Mowbray and Levitt. Levitt, again, being the Jewish soldier. They have been fighting because Mowbray has been basically insulting Levitt for being Jewish, with, again, a lot of troubling anti-Semitic elements here. But then Coates, who's the bombardier, the Arlie Ermy type guy, comes in and breaks it up, and he admonishes them. He says, "Look out there! What you see." He's an Afrikaner, by the way, so his first language is Afrikaans, which is a version of Dutch. So his English is somewhat idiomatic. Look out there. What you see? You see South Africa. What else? Blackness. Die zwart gewaar. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce that, because I don't speak Afrikaans. You're here to watch that, not to play silly buggers. Watch it. It's black and dangerous. So there's not much done there, but it's this passing reference. It's black and dangerous. And that's one of the things that Coetzee tries to continually instill in these soldiers, is this fear, this hatred, this belief that black South Africans and black Angolans are the enemy. They are terrorists. They are something to be hated and feared. And he makes the most overt the discussion of this in scene 5. He at one point, and I'll tell you about the event that happens just before this, because it is an interesting piece of the play. But he sits the whole squad down, and he says, "You cunts think the army is a big fucking joke, and you laugh on the other side of your face. I tell you there's a war going on, and you think it's none your problem. Or you think it's not your problem. But if they send you lot to the border, you'd be a sitting duck for that terrorists. They may be stupid Kafirs," which by the way is a South African racist slur against black people, "but they've been trained in Russia." And then he goes on later on, and he says that terrorists is going to Russia for training and then coming back here to stir shit. There's two kinds of terrorists, namely dead terrorists and live terrorists. The second one of these kinds is the problem. They just want to kill and destroy, and the rest of the world is two-faced. It just turns its back on South Africa. So we on our own. And remember, if the enemy gets past you, he's going to rape your mother and your sister and burn your house. So again, this is a culture of fear. This is a culture that instills the belief that violence is necessary, and that apartheid violence in particular is necessary in order for whites to protect themselves from the violence that anti-apartheid forces represent to them. This is actually a really great example of what the post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon called Manichaeism, or the Manichaean ethics of colonialism. The idea that the settler and the native, which are the terms that Fanon uses, are locked in an existential life and death struggle. The existence of the one inherently threatens the existence of the other. And so we see this ideology at play in Somewhere on the Border. We see this in Coetzee and the way that he talks about their enemy, the way that he talks about these anti-apartheid forces. So, I mean, in that sense, it's an extremely heavy play that definitely challenges apartheid ideology. And actually one of the things that's really striking about the second half of the play, when they've gone into Angola and they've started attacking terrorists, they've started attacking anti-apartheid forces, the Angolan military, etc., etc., they very quickly start developing PTSD. At one point, Marais, who's one of the Afrikaner soldiers, even says he thinks that Levitt is suffering from shell shock. And he does seem to be. I mean, he's extraordinarily jumpy and things like this. But by the end of the play, Marais is also suffering from shell shock, because the unit has killed a bunch of children. And this is one of the things that the South African military did in Angola, was not just engaged in combat with enemy combatants, but like the US forces in Vietnam, they very often wiped out entire communities, entire villages, towns, whatever it was. including old people, women, children, etc., etc. And that was quite a traumatizing thing for a lot of soldiers. And so, again, there's this indictment of South African military activity, not only because of the violence it perpetrates in Angola and against black people in South Africa, but also because of the psychological damage and the violent worldview that it encodes into white South Africans. So, again, this is all very heavy stuff, but there are also these moments of more lightness. There's this moment, there's a character called the Black Actor, who's called both John and Sam at different points. But at one point, at the beginning of scene 5, he's standing sort of downstage toward the audience, and he's sort of mocking the soldiers. He's sort of running them through their drills. He's saying, hick hack, you, which I don't know, I guess is the sort of South African equivalent of left, right, whatever it is that I don't know, U.S. military people chant to keep time while marching. So he's sort of doing this, and what it says in the stage directions is that he can basically run them around as long as this actor can run them around as long as he chooses by continuing to run through this drill. But then at some point, like, he gets spotted by Coates while he's mocking Coates, and Coates calls him over, and I don't know, gives him a dressing down, humiliates him a little bit, the way that Coates tends to do to everybody in the play. But then toward the end of this bit, it says the black actor gives Coates the fascist salute. As he turns, Coates kicks him in the backside. And the black actor says, smiling, "Danke, boss. Umsuna konyoko." I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but I mean, and I don't actually know what this means, because one of the interesting things about this collection is nothing is translated. Which, if you're a monolingual reader like I am, makes any of the conversations in Afrikaans just completely unhelpful on the page. But dankie boss would mean thank you boss, and boss was the very common term used by black and colored South Africans when addressing white people. So we got here this moment of what Homi Bhabha, another post-colonial theorist would call colonial mimicry. Like, the black actor is overplaying, satirically playing the part of the soldier by giving the fascist salute. And then this sort of gesture of thanks for physical violence is a satirical response to the violence of apartheid South Africa. So we've got that sort of balancing the play, the heaviness of the play.